I didn't make it all the way through because it's a New Yorker article. But I got most of the way through, I think. I mean, most of it were things I feel like I've read in other places.
It was.
It's nothing really new, you know?
I didn't
Yeah,
touch anything.
they're so proud of it. They're so happy about
I read
it.
it going into it being like, I must be missing something.
Yeah. Do you guys want to start? Because we have some people tuning into the
Really? Yeah. Gotta hear more about this.
All right. So we're going to get started a little bit early. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us today for this event on the U.S., Russia, and the growing media war. First and foremost, thank you once again to Verso Books for hosting this event, especially to Mr. Westhouse, who is like the force behind all of the events we do here. My name is Mariam Jamshidi. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Muftah, a digital magazine that covers global events, mostly in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. We are co-hosting this event, which is why I am talking to you right now. So we have some amazing panelists here, and I will introduce them in a minute. Before I do that, though, just want to frame the discussion, what we're going to be talking about and why it matters. So over the past 2 years, a quarter of a century after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the so-called New Cold War has become a go-to term amongst Western journalists describing the state of U.S.-Russia relations. Indeed, Russia and the United States have been on the opposite sides of a number of issues over the past several years, most notably the Ukraine crisis and the civil war in Syria. Since the 2016 U.S. presidential election and hack of the Democratic National Committee, allegedly carried out by groups directly linked to the Kremlin, tensions between the United States and Russia have intensified even further. In covering this relationship, the mainstream U.S. media has taken a markedly hostile tone towards Russia, focusing on President Vladimir Putin's alleged efforts to destabilize the West and undermine democracy through hacking, leaks, and propagation of fake news. Kremlin-funded media outlets such as Russia Today and Sputnik have taken the opposite approach, spreading positive coverage of Russia's domestic and international actions to English-language audiences around the world. Together, these outlets have chosen propaganda over impartiality and independence. There are also alarming parallels in how those skeptical of these narratives have been treated in Russia and the United States. In Russia, those who dare disagree with the Kremlin's official line have been labeled traitors and members of a fifth column. Some have even been attacked, harassed, and threatened. In the United States, more and more journalists and public figures who have challenged the mainstream media story about Russia have been called Putin apologists and agents of the Kremlin. In a recent piece for The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and one of the leading voices challenging U.S. media coverage of the hacking allegations, wrote, "In my 10-plus years of writing about politics on an endless number of polarizing issues, including the Snowden reporting, nothing remotely compares to the smear campaign that has been launched as a result of the work I've done questioning and challenging claims about Russian hacking and the threat posed by that country generally. In an atmosphere that hinders debate and discussion, it has become almost impossible to identify objective facts, even if they actually exist. And it is these facts, not allegations and speculation, that really matter today." So our distinguished panelists are here to shed some light on these issues and help us understand how the United States and Russia have employed various narratives against one another in their growing media war. So first we have Nina Khrushcheva, a professor of international affairs at the New School University in New York. She's a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute and a contributing editor of Project Syndicate. She is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Nina is the author of Imagining Nabokov, Russia Between Art and Politics, and The Lost Khrushchev, A Journey into the Gulag of the Russian Mind. Her articles have appeared in Newsweek, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and other publications. Next, we have Melissa Hooper. who is a lawyer and director of human rights and civil society programs at Human Rights First. Prior to joining Human Rights First 2 years ago, Melissa lived in Moscow, working as regional director for the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative, providing support and training to local lawyers, NGOs, human rights defenders, and journalists. Melissa's recent publications discuss Russia's use of its foreign policy to disseminate anti-civil society and xenophobic messaging and policies targeting immigrants and LGBT communities. Finally, we have Sam Biddle, a New York-based writer and reporter for The Intercept, where he focuses on technology, privacy, and power. Sam has written a number of pieces for The Intercept about the DNC hack and Russia's alleged role in the event. Previously, he was a senior writer at Gawker, the editor of Valleywag, and a senior reporter for Gizmodo. So, to start. So many are describing U.S.-Russia relations as a new Cold War, as I mentioned in the intro. So, do you agree? And if you do, why? And if you don't, obviously.
Should I start?
Yeah, please.
Relationship is bad, very bad. I am usually very much against already old labeling, because old labeling suggests that you already know what the problem is. And with a Cold War, we think that we know what the problem is, who the culprits are, who is the enemy, and how to deal with it. So when you say the new Cold War, you immediately stop thinking. You just think about, say, Cuban Missile Crisis, which you shouldn't, or maybe not yet. So at the beginning, when it all began, I kept insisting that if we want to describe the animosity, perhaps we should be talking about frozen peace, something new that we can discuss and elaborate on. So for that reason, I disagree, although the relationship now is such a low point that probably Cold War is a good description, and I would put it in quotes. But at the same time, it really doesn't let us out of this vicious cycle of how they are going to bash each other at every turn, Russia and the United States.
Sure. I also would disagree. And for similar reasons, in that I feel like if we use the term Cold War, then we're trying to say that there is this fight for influence, or that the U.S. and Russia are not trying to communicate with each other the way they did in the Cold War, that there is kind of a line drawn that can't be crossed, and we're going to you stay on your side, I'll stay on our side. And I feel like they're still thinking about how to engage, but it is so tricky and fraught with so many other moving pieces that it's not a unified argument, but that it's now multi-layered. And so I feel like maybe I'm saying the same thing that Nita just said, but I feel like the Cold War just way oversimplifies it.
I think that it's impossible to divorce what's going on now in terms of U.S.-Russian relations and how it's perceived in the U.S. from the election. And for that reason, it seems like it'd be hard to call it a Cold War, given that it's mostly in our heads, in our collective imaginations, and a lot of us are really just acting out our angst and terror and befuddlement about what happened in November. About American politics. You can't remove Trump from any of this, but if you remove Trump from any of it, there's nothing really left to talk about. This has become a way of Republicans and Democrats to attack one another, which I think it's way more that than it is between a duke out between the U.S. and Russia.
Okay, so that's an interesting point and an important one. So do you all agree that, Melissa and Nina, and perhaps you can elaborate more on sort of the focal point or the origin of these tensions, these apparent tensions between the United States and Russia? Go ahead.
Right, because Ukraine, it actually
right.
began.
So did it start with Ukraine?
No, it actually began when Putin announced that he's going to become president again in 2012, and in 2011 Russia went to the streets, and the United States decided that that's the moment then democracy suddenly would hit, or finally would hit Russia, and so it was such a disappointment that Putin came in and whatnot. So I actually think that it really began in 2011. It just ratcheted up with Ukraine, and then ratcheted it up and with the Olympics, and then ratcheted up with the elections. But the whole war, I agree with. I mean, what is the war over? I mean, what are they really fighting? Because before the Cold War, it was communism, capitalism. So what's the war about now? And when the United States says Russia is against, they don't share our values, well, and so does China, or so does Saudi Arabia, but that's okay. And when it's Russia, then it becomes a problem. And that's why I think there's a lot of, as Melissa said very correctly, there's so many moving pieces that people forget the details of what they're talking about.
Melissa, do you?
And I also think, so yes, I think that going back to this September 2011 announcement of, Putin and Medvedev switching places and the protests that happened after that were a big deal. And that is what started to concern Putin in that he had seen this pattern of colored revolutions and seen what the U.S. is doing with its pro-democracy policies or democracy spreading policies. And I think that concern started to become very real in Russia. And so Russia was reacting at that point. And I think that the U.S. has just kind of popped up its head and started to realize how Russia is perceiving the U.S. perhaps, and become more attentive to that because of what's going on in our own politics that's making us pay more attention to Russia.
So you think that the tensions really began mostly on the Russian side, with Russia starting to become concerned or becoming more concerned about U.S. influence inside Russia or within other countries that Russia considered to be within its sphere of influence? Is that where you would locate the origin of this, or does that not do a good job of explaining it either?
I think it's good enough. I mean, because
yeah.
Since I follow every twist and turn of this, I would go back. I don't think it began with Russia, but I'm a Russian, so I'm biased. I actually think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think it began with the United States expanding NATO to the Russian borders in the 2000s. And that's when the Russians said, we thought we were Putin said, we thought you are our friend, Tony Blair and George Bush, and apparently you are not. And then Dick Cheney, remember Dick Cheney? Went to Lithuania. Now he seems like such a Democrat. He went to Lithuania and he gave a speech that Putin is not Russia is not a democracy and Putin is not a Democrat. And Putin's reaction was, really? Who's talking? And that's when the Russians, and then Putin gave, it was 2006, and then Putin was the man of, I think was Time Magazine Man of the Year. And if you read that, if you're interested in Russia, go back to that, set of interviews, and you can read every single thing that he's going to do, and every single thing that he thinks the United States has done and will do, and it's really all of it, all the origins in 2007. But once again, this is probably too complicated.
So what role do you think that the Ukraine crisis and then Syria played in escalating tensions? Was Ukraine the main escalation and then Syria sort of just maintained this sort of more difficult relationship between the two countries? Do you find one to be more important than the other when it comes to U.S.-Russia relations at the moment?
Well, from my perspective, I think I was in Russia when Ukraine happened, when Russia went into Crimea, and I feel like that was a major shift and a major change. Because that, even within Russia, you had Russians arguing within families on the streets with each other. It was such a it was such a moment of sort of lining up. What is your opinion of this? What is your ideology? And so I feel like at that moment, you have the U.S. Pointing out that Russia is violating international boundaries and international law. And I think that what you've seen is that from Russia's perspective, the U.S. has been doing that. The U.S. did that in in the Balkans. The U.S. has, did that in Iraq. And so you have Putin citing prior U.S. violations. But from the U.S. perspective, this was without invitation, without justification, without responsibility to protect doctrine applying. And so I do think that that's where it started, that the U.S. started to see Russia and see Putin, I think, specifically as a threat that they didn't know how to respond to.
So how has Russia's involvement in Syria, if at all, been a countervailing force in tensions between the U.S. and Russia? I think it was towards the end of the Obama administration, after the election, where Kerry was sort of pushing the administration or trying to influence the administration to not take too substantial of a stance against Russia in terms of the hacking allegations and other things, in the hopes that Russia could be a useful player in Syria. To what extent do you think that trend is, or that analysis or view on the way Syria has maybe helped somewhat mollify the relationship is correct?
Well, I actually, to Melissa's point, I also want to say there was also Georgia in 2008.
Yeah.
So that was one of those colored revolutions that the Russians are not going to allow. And in fact, Mikhail Saakashvili, who was very much supported by the Americans, at the time went into South Ossetia, and the Russians took it as a sign that Americans are interfering in Russian affairs. And one of the things that Putin is very much objecting to is that he says, well, I'm not undermining American values, I'm just exposing American hypocrisy. That's what I do, because they do the same thing, but they pretend that it's democracy building, and actually it is not. I think with Syria, it was really very interesting because Barack Obama began it himself. In 2013, as you remember, the red line, when Barack Obama announced the red line, and then he was not ready to meet up the red line himself, so he went to Putin for help. And I love my people, but if you ask a former KGB man for a favor, you would have to pay up. And they had no exit strategy. They had no back plan, and that is really something that I completely get baffled by, because who was advising that White House on Russia? It's not, Putin can be talked to, but you have to figure out how Russians think and what they think, and it's the country with the deepest inferiority complex and the deepest superiority complex, so you kind of have to balance out those things. So that's what Putin was objecting to, but for the problem with the Americans is that Russia lost the Cold War, and so they felt that, at least certainly the Obama administration, they felt that Russia therefore had no word to say. So we're going to do what we do, but nobody else would speak. And I think Syria exasperated that, because they tried to make the relationship, make the story happen, but supporting Assad or supporting the opposition really was a very complicated issue. And then it turned in ideological, and I think that's what Intercept always writes about, that a lot of this story is really not about the facts. It's about...
Everything you're saying is true and has nothing to do with what everyone is worried about right now, right? I wish that this were the debate,
Exactly.
that people were, that there were congressional debates over Syria policy, or that Chris Hayes on MSNBC was asking people about Syria policy and
Right.
Russian involvement. That would be a worthwhile thing to be worried and upset about, right? I mean, it's an ongoing disaster, but is completely removed from the current panic.
Well, the panic is, how dare they?
Oh, right.
Those
Yeah.
Russians. We want the Cold War, and then 25 years later, they come back and tell us that we're not the perfect country.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's the origin of kind of the craziness that goes on both sides.
So to get to this point that you raised, Sam, so how has the current media rhetoric about Russia affected public interest or concerns in the West with the human rights situation in Russia, with Russia's involvement in Ukraine and Syria? Might Russia actually be happy about the media's decision to turn its back on those other issues and to focus on its nefarious role in so-called role in the U.S. election.
I can't imagine how this would not make the Kremlin and Putin ecstatic, because now again they are like a global supervillain, right? And we are scared shitless over what they will do next and what they did and their abilities and their schemes, and it's dominated the news cycle for what it started in summer of last year. So since then, I don't think a day has gone by where there hasn't been a news story about Russian influence in the United States. And I think that for a country with a deep-seated inferiority complex, like you said, that is a real, an awakening, right? Like they're back. That doesn't serve anyone but the Russian government. But yeah, to answer your question, I think that they would be very happy. That's my guess.
No?
They are, absolutely. Suddenly Putin is an exhibitionist. You've seen it. The boobs are always there.
He's on Saturday Night
He's
Live
always,
every week.
exactly,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Showing off.
And he is like that. It's not, culture never lies about politics, so clearly. So he loves it. He loves the fact that, and whether true or not, the fact that as a former KGB man is giving credit for taking down,
Right.
essentially almost taking down American democracy, that's a KGB dream for 75 years. And suddenly Putin got it.
Right.
And
So
it's not going to
there-
go away. The next
Right,
right.
elections, for as long as we're alive, probably now, this will be looming large.
Absolutely.
So,
And so for the Russians, the Russians are living worse. The situation, the economic situation is worse, but yay, we're back in super global power, so it doesn't matter. Even if we starve to death, we're a global power. So in some ways it really works wonderful. It actually works probably better for the Russians than it works for the Americans.
Right, because he's never come out, Russian officials come out and said, we didn't do this, right?
No,
Have
they do.
they?
They come out
They have?
every day.
Oh, they do? Oh, they
Yes.
deny
Every
it.
day.
Oh, yeah, they have denied it.
Every day. They deny it every day.
Okay.
But I think there's this understanding of like, we're going to like,
They
in
won't
Russia,
believe us
nobody
anyway.
believes that they
Right,
would
so
say,
we might as well
we
deny
did
it.
this.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. But I also think, we give Russia, we give Putin in particular, this huge gift, not only in saying that Russia influenced our elections and is this big, large presence, but in also starting to question our own democracy and whether we are really a functioning democracy, and in believing that maybe our media isn't always true, and maybe there isn't something as steadfast as truth in all of those things. I think that that Putin is very pleased because he set himself up, I think years ago, as sort of an alternative to the American style of governing and the American belief in liberalism. And so saying that, we don't need this concept, for example, we don't need this concept of human rights. We'll tell you that there is sort of a sovereign democracy concept of human rights, and that means that LGBT rights, for example, can be subjugated to family rights or something like that. Like, we have a different way of thinking. And so now that different way of thinking, which is that truth is not objective and that everything is relative, is now catching hold here, and that is an even bigger gift, I think.
But also, I just want to say that Putin didn't do it. It's
Right.
the Americans themselves.
doing it.
Right, are doing it to themselves and blaming Russians for doing it, but he didn't do it. And so he's watching this and thinking, wow, that American democracy really is screwed up. Because if they can do it to themselves and then blame me for that, that's bad, that's shit, that really doesn't work. Or works for him. So that's another thing that I think, as Sam mentioned, it would be great to have a real conversation instead of really ratcheting up the rhetoric and accuse the other side of the problems that either country has.
So, so let's talk a little bit about the U.S. media, and particularly the coverage on the DNC hack, which you have written quite a bit about. Why do you think the media has been so quick to accept the government's line on this story, rather
I think about that a lot.
uncritically? What do you think it's unique to this situation? We saw them do it with Iraq. We've seen them do it with a number of things. But does this somehow feel or seem or appear different to you?
Yes. What's particularly different to me, I think, is the liberal media and liberal audiences, liberal readerships, suddenly seeing the CIA and the American intelligence community as yeah, as the heroes, as you know, Captain America. And the number of, you know, I hate to use Twitter as a polling mechanism, but the number of tweets I've seen from people who are not, you know, who have their own TV show or who are magazine writers saying, you know, wow, the CIA might actually fix this, like might actually get Trump out of there, which is a horrifying thought. Like, I imagine the people in this room probably didn't vote for Donald Trump. But regardless of what you think about the man, no matter how much you might despise him and his policies and his cabinets, to have the president ousted by the CIA would be 1,000 times worse than any Russian meddling. I mean, that would end American democracy, to have a coup, you know, by the intelligence state. Anyway, you know, to answer your question, yes, to me, in my experience, this is like nothing else I've seen.
Well, it's actually interesting just because also we all need an enemy. I mean, you know, we always need an opposition. That's why the Cold War was such a great thing, because us versus them really works every time. But also, and in some ways, it never really stopped, because if you look at Hollywood continued to create Russia as an enemy, even in 1997, when the Russians were just loving America more than life itself. So you need an enemy, and at the time it was Fidel Castro, small island, good, but not that good, small. And in some ways, I mean, if you look in cultural terms, Russia is a great enemy because I look like you. Not necessarily exactly, but good enough. I'm white. There's no political correct complex going on. You know how to hate me. Not that you do, but you do. I mean, from the Cold War, you know how to. Invasion of the body snatchers is all good. So in some ways, it also plays into this sort of cultural cultural mythology and ideology. And so, for example, if you take the Panama Papers, a lot of leaders were implicated in that. The only person that people talked about, Charlie Rose, started every single newscast with the fact, Putin is implicated, because Putin is a big villain. I mean, you said it's villain. It's basically, Putin is an anti-James Bond. I mean, he's a spy, he was a former spy. So, and I think a lot of it is not only political, but very, very cultural.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I don't think you can overlook the extent to which having a killer narrative is really seductive. I mean, if you're at the New York Times and someone from the CIA, FBI comes to you and says, look, I'll tell you that we think that Russia did such and such, and it sounds like a plot from a James Bond movie or a Tom Clancy novel, you're going to be, you know, it's going to be very attractive to you, because you have now whether a Cold War redux story that you know people are going to be incredibly interested in. It involves Trump, it involves superpowers, it involves, you know, Hillary Clinton, it involves all the hot words, right? I think that's very seductive.
Well, I just think that we should at least acknowledge that it does involve our president, and it does involve this dossier with some really lurid details. And so I think it's not just Russia, it's also that sort of the lurid part of the
Sure.
dossier, and the fact that it is kind of this, you know, it's not just the narrative, but the fact that it does involve our president.
It's a lurid man.
Yes.
But it also, I mean, the whole president fits into an entertainment James Bond reality TV / formula. So in some ways it becomes even more compelling as a story. I was talking to a journalist and I said, so why are you calling Putin a murderer? Can we just discuss what's done rather than just brand him as a dictator? Because Joseph Stalin is a dictator, Pol Pot is a dictator, Putin is not a dictator. He's an autocrat, yes, but that's a difference, and actually big difference, like millions of killed people difference. And this journalist said to me, but he's such a compelling villain. I was like, well, I'm sorry, you're reporting the news. That's entertainment. So he's a compelling villain.
So in terms of this idea that that has been constantly, you know, within all of these stories about the DNC hack and the Trump-Russia relationship, this underlying narrative, and again, it's a part of the compelling nature of the story, right, is that American democracy is under threat, and it's under threat from Russia, from Putin. So how extensive is this exaggeration in your view? And what kind of consequences do you think it's having, particularly in this country? And blaming the erosion of American democracy, assuming it's happening, on Russia. Blaming the rise of Trump on Russia.
Go for it.
I think it is, you know, a enormous disaster being set up for 2020, because I think that there will be very little learned from the past election. There will be very little changed about the Democratic Party and how it operates and how it fields candidates and campaigns, because a lot of people now in the party and party supporters are going to say, look, we lost because the most evil autocrat in the world had his finger on the scale. We didn't lose fair and square. And so it's not our fault that the Democrats lost to Donald Trump. You know, it's a lot more comforting to say we were doomed, we were sabotaged, than to say we lost to some of the dumbest fuckers in the world, like truly the most incompetent people ever to arrive in the American political landscape. Like, shockingly stupid, right? And just incapable of getting anything done. So it's easier to say, you know, the most sophisticated spy agency, most diabolical, you know, GRU, FSB, infiltrators ruined the Clinton campaign versus like, you know, we blew it. I don't know, you know, like, but that's what's happening. Is no one is learning any lessons. No one is saying, no. There's no post-mortem being done. It's just immediately the jump from Hillary Clinton's loss to, you know, clear and present danger, or, you know, hunt for Red October kind of stuff. And like, you know, that makes me very worried for the next election.
And specifically, you know, I do think that Russia was playing around with some of its strategies that it had used in Europe in the past in terms of narratives and use of media.
I think we hacked them, yeah.
But I think that the result was so much more pronounced than Russia thought, and I don't think that Putin believed that this result would happen, and I don't think that this was a result of Putin, of Russia meddling. I mean, I've been doing research recently on the you know, Breitbart, Cambridge Analytica, you know, SCL Group strategies that are essentially using a very sophisticated form of analyzing voters and what voters like on media and how their psychological profiles could maybe be shifted so that their emotions can be manipulated to move them in a certain political direction. And that is frightening. And that is all coming from here. And that is not at all what Russia has been doing, which is kind of saying, you know, democracy is threatening, democracy is failing, just kind of repeating this repetition fallacy. And that, of course, it's rudimentary and that can work, but this is really strategic. And so I think that we are ignoring this strategic assault on rights and on the international liberal order that's coming from inside the U.S. by looking at Russia, because Russia did this little thing that coincided with this other bomb.
So, yeah, I just wanted to say that. I mean, I'm saying this as someone who thinks that, in all likelihood, you know, an operative of the Russian government did hack the DNC. I think. Sure, right, absolutely.
And think tanks.
Yeah, everyone, and people in this room probably. But I think the effect is, like you said, has been, you know, cartoonishly overstated. If you look at what actually came out of those hacked emails, there wasn't. I mean, it hurt Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but you know, there wasn't anything tremendously damaging about, in my opinion, as somebody wrote about it, the Clinton campaign itself, or Hillary herself.
So is it fair to say that if Hillary had won, you don't think that we'd be having these conversations right now about Russian interference?
Well, you know, yeah, I think we might be, but it'd be people, you know, be different people. Different people would be upset about it. No, I don't think that. I don't think you'd see op-eds from John Podesta and Robbie Mook about Putin's influence. No.
And you wouldn't have had, because in that circumstance, you wouldn't have had a president saying, oh, those sanctions, we don't need those sanctions, and oh, Putin is great, which Hillary Clinton said. And I think that ratcheted it up also, because people were like, what? What does that mean? What are you saying? And
yeah, I think Trump is too stupid to be as savvy as he's being made out to be. I mean, he contradicts himself too often to be, some sort of Manchurian candidate. He's mostly an oaf, I think. Sorry, what were we?
No, I actually see, I'm sort of, people say Putin is stupid just because they don't like him. He's not, and I think.
No, I'm in Trump.
Right, no, I know, but a lot of so when we disagree, we often tend to become, I teach propaganda, so for me, it's all these things are very familiar in some ways, because that enemy is created and has been discussed in exactly sort of textbook propaganda text. I mean, it's just unbelievable how familiar all this is. I think that, like Putin, Trump reads the audience really, really well. And so they know exactly what to do and say. When Melissa and I were talking about that earlier, is that if Barack Obama would come out and say, Putin is a great man, we really need to work with Putin. Trump would come out and say, he's an idiot. I think we need to bomb Russia tomorrow. Because in some ways, he does things that they do on the Survivor Island. I mean, they just sort of do things that completely incomprehensible. So he creates not only narratives, but also creates numbers. And I think that sort of in some ways unite them with Putin. But I want to go back to Sam's point a little bit. We need an enemy, and everybody needs to blame somebody. And I think, as I mentioned, Russia is a really great place to start. And nobody wants to admit that they did something wrong and that Hillary Clinton was not a great candidate and whatnot. But I'm not sure that if Hillary Clinton were elected, it actually would have been better. Because I think that then they would start, those investigations would not be just in possible works. They would be all going at it and really making them happen. And that Cuban Missile Crisis also, I mean, it can happen with Trump. In fact, I'm sure it will happen with Trump. But it would probably also could happen with Hillary Clinton, because she called Putin Hitler. You don't call a Russian Hitler. I mean, that's one of the reasons that Putin was if they were hacking, and I'm sure they were hacking, is that he was basically showing her what he can do. Because if she dares to call him Hitler, she's a politician. You don't call. Whatever you think of him, you really cannot do this. You can't call a politician a leader of a big country, regardless of what he is in your mind, call him Hitler, then all bets are off. So if you are not going to be ethical, he is thinking, I'm not going to be ethical either. So in some ways, this is just that war of words and war of actions that can, you ask what the consequences. I think the consequences are very dire, because there's really no checks and balances and stop mechanisms for that.
So to talk a little bit about the Russian side of things. So a lot has been written about the Kremlin propaganda machine in recent years, about the tactics that English language media like RT and Sputnik use. How do you see today's Russian propaganda as being different from the Soviet era propaganda, or the same? Do you think that it poses a real danger to the United States or European countries?
I love the Bush administration because they were perfect for propaganda, I have to say. They were just such a trove of things that one would understand. Donald Rumsfeld, remember Donald Rumsfeld? Secretary of Defense, he said that their perception of inevitability of a conflict often becomes the root of that conflict. And I really think that just really covers all of it. Yes, it is dangerous because you ratchet up the rhetoric. I mean, and that happened in 1962. I mean, the rhetoric on both sides were coming up, and suddenly the Cuban Missile Crisis just turned into a possible disaster. So yes, I think with Russia today and Sputnik, it's not your grandfather propaganda when you have just one Pravda story that says communism is horrible and we are the greatest. It actually has individual stories. It is tailored towards individual audiences, because one of the things that people think in a democracy that propaganda happens on these bad guys. Propaganda happens to everybody. I mean, and so it is very Western to some degree. It doesn't speak to all audiences. It speaks to some audiences. And it also, as all good propaganda should, it has a kernel of truth in it. So when you say that Barack Obama is hysterically against Putin, Well, yes, to some degree, and you kind of quote Barack Obama, who calls Putin the slouchy kid at the back of the classroom. True, that did happen. So in this sense, it is dangerous, but so is, sort of journalists who, or politicians who say Putin is a killer and Putin is a murderer and Putin is and his thugs, because I think when journalism, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but I think when journalism start using labels, it stops being journalism. Because once you start applying adjectives to your story, that is already not what the story is. It's not about the facts, it's about the perception.
So to talk a little bit about the sort of the way that the label that's being used now to talk about Russian propaganda, which is fake news. So
But so is New York Times.
right. Well, it started out being used with respect to so-called Russian propaganda. So do you think this concern with fake news is overblown, and is it really only about false information, or does it sweep in other things? Right, as you mentioned, apparently the New York Times is now fake news. CNN, I mean, all the big guys. This label, though, started shortly after the election and was geared towards stories that were supposedly coming out of Russia or Russian, those who were allies of Russia, to smear Hillary Clinton. But do you think now that it's sort of taken on a life of its own? It seems like it has, but I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think it's become and how it is affecting journalism, particularly on U.S.-Russia issues.
You're a journalist.
I mean, I wrote about it pretty early on, and I wish I hadn't, just because it lost like everything loses meaning pretty quickly online, but lost meaning, and not only lost all of its meaning, but was co-opted by the exact people it was supposed to be describing. Like when you have Infowars, if you have Alex Jones calling things fake news, then you're really down the rabbit hole. I mean, when it was first started, when it was first employed, it was describing you weren't saying that an article was incorrect or that a headline was inaccurate. You were saying it was a hoax, right? It was the equivalent of saying, there's like a little boy stuck in a well somewhere, and there never was. Like the purpose was to deceive people, and actually it was a financial scam. There were ads attached, and so you would make a lot of money if you could make a Facebook group with 500,000 people in it who believed that the Pope gave Hillary Clinton gonorrhea or something. Like these were like supermarket tabloid story, right? Or vice versa. These were supermarket tabloid caliber stories. They weren't just misleading or factually flawed. And I think that, I do believe that was a serious problem with this election. Media illiteracy is I think a crisis in the U.S. You have millions of people in this country who are unable to discern between, because they were never taught how, between a newspaper, even a biased newspaper source, and like some guy's Facebook page. Part of the problem is because they appear the exact same on Facebook. And I do think Facebook is an enormous problem here. But yeah, that's now just, the sooner we can all stop saying it, the better, but I don't think it'll be anytime soon because the president's saying it, so.
Can I just highlight, I think so the fake news sort of specter of fake news, I think first was discussed quite a bit in Europe when you had, there was a strategy that Russia was employing to use very small outlets in Europe to disseminate articles about stories that weren't either a kernel of truth or weren't true in order to get a certain narrative out. And there was a time when a lot of those narratives, the goal of Russia was to say, look, this whole EU experiment may be not working for you all. It's become unsafe, and they used migrants, refugees, Muslims, and sometimes LGBTQ people as scapegoats in that, and would say, there are migrants raping, a bunch of migrants raped a woman in Germany, for example, or that migrants and Muslims are committing terrorist acts in Europe, and for these reasons, the EU is unsafe. And so I think that it was dangerous and still is dangerous in that it's creating targets of minority communities and spreading information that is often not true about certain communities, that then, when that information gets picked up, people of their own accord start taking actions against those individuals and communities. So that was one of the fake news problems that appeared before the US election even existed. And then when it was employed here, I think it took on a completely different life and went in a new direction, and is not, the fake news here, even about migrants and refugees, is all US-based fake news. But I just wanted to highlight that had been a real problem, is that the minority communities were targeted.
Did you?
Yes, I actually want to defend my Russians here.
Okay.
Okay, so Russia isn't in the middle of it, not necessarily because we're good at propaganda. Propaganda is art. We're good at art. Not so much in politics, but art is what we do. So when one discusses Russia, suddenly facts and measured terms and terms that would be liable in other instances don't matter anymore. You actually can describe the Russians in terms that you wouldn't describe other instances. So that actually creates an atmosphere, and also use sound bites, an atmosphere in which then the media gets discredited. So that's the American problem. But also, to your point, true. But what I do know of those influencing small places, Russians are creative, but that kind of dissemination of information of similar sorts actually came out of American fringe
Yes,
publications.
that's true.
That is not, Russians are great in big things, because, 11 time zones, it's very important, but not so much. So they read Breitbart News and they say, oh my God, what a story. Or something is being read in a tabloid that I think the Obamas are divorcing because I think he's in love with a white woman or something. And no, seriously, it's not, it's a true story. And so there was a tabloid here that published that, I forgot, I don't read those, but something. And then the journalist from Izvestia, a very important paper, wrote an article about this. And everybody was calling me and saying, oh my God, Barack Obama is leaving Michelle Obama. They seem so much in love. And he's in love with a white woman now. And so it really comes out, because one of the things that the United States does, when it doesn't know how closely it's being watched. And Putin's crime is that he decided, and people around him decided, that no moment of American hypocrisy is going to pass them by. So they're going to use every single opportunity to say, they're lying here, they're lying here, they're doing this, they're doing this. And it's all a payback for, he wanted to be part of the West, and he really didn't make it. And now he's just saying, fine, I'm going to tear it down. Actually, you're going to tear it down yourself.
I'm going to watch you.
And I'm going to watch
How do you see that propaganda working in Russia? Do you see it as creating more support for Putin? Do you see it
absolutely.
as being
enemy.
effective?
Yes.
Yeah, right, and sort of like
Well, it's 65 in normal terms.
so the U.S. enemy
You need an
is
enemy.
for Putin just as effective.
Sam was saying, Sam said that you've never seen this story because you really need a good enemy. And the United States, it's all about the United States. It was actually, even in the 2000s, it was already about the United States, but it did get kind of life on its own after 2011, and then with the Olympics when the United States decided to snub him and whatnot. So absolutely, it does work.
Yeah.
Because even if the Russians don't like, Trump is funny, let's just face it. And he's funny to the Russians too, but that Hillary, they say the same thing, but Trump speaks here, it's like, well, that Hillary, and the Russians do the same thing. So Hillary would have been worse.
Yeah.
And what I've been reading is that over maybe last year, there are a lot of narratives about how the U.S. is amassing weapons 100 kilometers from the border of Russia, and what they mean is NATO is developing a strategy here, but that is the U.S. amassing weapons. And then there was, if we need to go to bread rationing, because of some sort of invasion, here's what the Russian will be. You know, we just want everyone to know. And so doing things like that to just let people know, you know, war might be imminent, maybe, if the U.S. wants it. So, you know, there is a little bit of war fear-mongering going on, I think, related to that. One other quick note about Russian media is I think it's been interesting to see what happens as they try to figure out what to do with Trump, because there was this love fest about Trump. I think, you know, as when Trump first came in, like, you know, this is going to be great for Russia, this will be wonderful. And then what I'm hearing and reading from people now is that there's a little bit of kind of a stall, like, well, wait a second here, we're not so sure about this Trump guy. It's a little bit unpredictable. We don't know what we bought, kind of thing. We don't know what we got from all of this.
So in the middle of all of this, you know, you have the media that seems largely unified around one narrative. You have sort of Russia, the media, and then the U.S. establishment, U.S. government establishment, sort of around, seemingly agreeing on one kind of narrative about what's going on. Then you have sort of maybe the same thing going on in Russia with Putin on board. And then you have Donald Trump, who tells Bill O'Reilly, right, in response to that question about why do you support Putin? Putin's a war criminal. Well, do you think we're so innocent? Is Trump the only one telling the truth about Russia in this circumstance? I mean, what is Trump? How does Trump, as an individual, as the president of the United States, but also as an important player in all of this, how does he fit in terms of the propaganda narrative? Is he part of it? I mean, is he actively creating propaganda around this issue as well, or is he playing another kind of role?
I think he's not sophisticated enough to be doing really anything intentionally. I think he sort of parrots whatever the last person he talked to said about anything. But it is something really frustrating, and that's really messed with my head since the election, is that, and even during the campaign, is that he has a habit of saying correct things for the completely wrong reason, and he doesn't realize that he's making a good point, and then he'll immediately contradict it. But he'll say things like, would it be so bad if the U.S. and Russia were on better terms? Why would that be a bad thing? Of course it would be a good thing, and of course it would be a good thing. But he doesn't know what he's saying, but he's coming so close to making a good point, or like the O'Reilly thing, where he says, you think the U.S. is so innocent? That's a fantastic point. You want to talk about electoral interference done by an intelligence agency? The CIA will show you a lot of successes over the years. But when Trump says that to O'Reilly, he's doing it because he's defensive and vain, not because he has any historical sense of any, of literally anything. He's like an ahistorical being. But he does have these moments where you're like, God, I wish you would realize why you're saying this and keep going. But he won't. But it is refreshing and for a millisecond.
Do you?
But I actually think I continue to disagree with someone that I actually think that he knows what he's talking about. It's just skin deep, because it is a reality TV statement. So it's not that he's dumb. It's just he's not smart within the reality. It's only on the right. It's the screen perception, and there he's good. It's like Duck Dynasty. Crisley knows best. The Apprentice. He's good at that. Yeah. It's just when we enter reality that becomes a problem. So I think in this sense, and that's why he sometimes makes a lot of sense. But what I also think that I think there's a lot of false narrative being created by all of them. And I think that is a problem. Of course, he creates his own propaganda for his own purposes and his own reason. But since I've been following Trump since '95, some of you haven't been alive then. No, seriously, he actually, as vain as he is, he wanted a Trump Tower on the Red Square. Huh? That would have been a project. And at the time, in '95, although we were villains in Hollywood, we loved America. We were willing to give anything. I mean, you want to buy the Red Square, just go for it. So he really did talk to, but even Boris Yeltsin actually didn't work out for him because it just seemed a little bit bizarre. So it didn't work out, but he has been quoting the Russians for, 2 decades now. He brought his Miss Universe. He gave interviews saying how much in love he's going to be with Putin if Putin comes to the Miss Universe dinner. So he was doing that. I mean, Putin is an impressive man, and there's a lot of leaders in the world, kind of the aspiring dicks. They do want to be Putin. I mean, it's not just Trump. And so in some ways, I think it's psychological, is that Putin is a role model for a lot of those kind of people who want to make decisions unilaterally, and it does seem to work for Putin. So I think, but in some ways, it's false narratives are being created on all sides.
So, as part of its anti-Western rhetoric, the Kremlin regularly smears the concept of human rights, as you mentioned, as something that the United States, with the help of its NGOs, is using to influence and affect the Russian domestic politics. And the argument seems to have some truth to it. The National Endowment for Democracy, which is, of course, funded by the U.S. Congress through the State Department, sponsors quite a few political groups inside Russia. And indeed, because of the crackdown inside Russia against civil society, financial support from the West is really important. So, how can Russian human rights activists continue to do their work while they are, on the one hand, being attacked by their government without appearing to be subservient to Western funders? And of course, then you have this backdrop of propaganda and narratives inside Russia about the United States and its interference. All right. So, what happens to civil society in Russia in this context, Melissa?
So what is happening? It has been interesting because being in conversation with Russian NGOs and activists as the foreign agent law was coming down, as the undesirable NGO law or undesirable organizations law was coming down, we were asking them, what do you want us to do? And they were often saying, just step back, just let us do what we're going to do. Let us, pull these protests together. Let us decide the narratives that we want to use to describe ourselves, because it is often not helpful to have the U.S. standing up for us when we want to communicate to our government that we organically don't like what they are doing. But I think that it has become quite difficult because whenever they do so, now there is this branding that they are just speaking on behalf of a foreign government, that they must be doing this on behalf of a foreign government. And I've mentioned LGBT issues a couple of times because I think that has been a real consternation between Russia and the U.S. to the extent that you have individuals and groups being told that they are gay because the U.S. told them they were gay. And so it is, in some circles developed to be a Western concept. So how do you get out of that? The fact that U.S. funding is having such a hard time going for civil society going into Russia right now, I think is creating its own microcosm, like its own new world. You're going to see what NGOs in Russia are going to do, and that will be organically developing, and Russia won't be able to say it's U.S. funding because there's so little that's able to get there now. But I think that what you do see is that organizations are now just pushing ahead with very little funding and with very little outside support, and they're still continuing to go, and they're doing whatever they can, and they're trying to crowdfund, but there's not a good community there's not a good culture for developing that kind of thing, but they're doing whatever they can. There's no good answer.
Did you want to say anything?
Just a little bit. I mean, I think you're right, there's a big crisis, and a lot of it was because of American-owned hypocrisy. Because when America would come in and say, we'll tell you what to do, and then when you start deconstructing what America really does, then for autocrats like Putin, that's a really very good breeding ground for their own propaganda. And so I think that for the time being, the word democracy is discredited, human rights is discredited, all of this is discredited, and it's not the Western fault, but it's certainly going to play out for years to come, and Putin is planning probably to be in the Kremlin until 2024 unless he's taken out. and even longer, because I don't believe that he can really leave the Kremlin, because if he leaves, he probably dies, as Russians do, those who leave the Kremlin. So I think that is really a very, very big problem, and as decisions are not, I mean, not decisions, but there's really not good answer, not good solution at all.
And there was, I think you're right, that there was this philosophy that was underlying U.S. assistance, especially in Russia, but all over the region. That was, well, we know what democracy is, and let us teach you.
Right.
And while we're doing like crazy shit in,
Elsewhere.
other places. And so then, way too late, you saw in the late aughts, the U.S. saying, why don't we partner on this? And why don't we learn how to do this together, recognizing our own, we're having our own issues. Like, I worked on this prison experiment, or what am I starting to say, project. And it was, the U.S., it has the worst prison record in the world. And so, we can't teach you anything about it, but that was way too late.
Yeah.
Russia was already like, sorry.
And Putin really follows this thing so closely. Every time when there is a blunder, he's going to take advantage of it.
So our last question, and then I'd love to open it up for questions from the audience. For you, Sam. So you and your colleagues at The Intercept have extensively covered the hacking scandal, as we've discussed, and recently some of your colleagues' criticisms from other some of your colleagues have received criticism from other journalists for their adversarial stance towards the Democrats and the U.S. establishment when it comes to the validity of the reports that have been coming out of the intelligence community, and for making demands about more solid proof of the hacking. Some of them have been called Putin apologists and accused of receiving money from the Kremlin.
Yeah, I mean, I have, yes.
And as have you. So,
Not
so
have received,
why,
have been
so
accused.
why is this problematic, and what kind of challenges does it pose to journalism in the
Oh,
United
God,
States?
it's problematic because I think a reporter's job is to be skeptical, and especially skeptical of the CIA and the FBI and the White House and the KGB, right? And any when that skepticism is immediately met with, well, you're only doing this because you must be in Vladimir Putin's pocket. I mean, that's really frightening. I've never gotten the kind of response that I've got, and I've been pulled through some dark stuff, on the internet. Yeah, right. So but I've been called a lot of things on Twitter, but a torture apologist, a Putin apologist, is not one of them, and it has a silencing, discrediting effect, right? I mean, you don't want to be viewed as the Kremlin's guy at The Intercept or in the New York or American media, and it was just really dismaying to see so few other reporters, so few other outlets, even saying, well, wait, let's assess what is coming out of the U.S. government. Let's, rather than just reprinting it, the number of outlets that put, alleged Russian hacking, rather than just going with, oh, well, they did it, we'll put it in the headline, was startlingly few. And again, I mean, the whole time I saw it as totally plausible that Russians or a branch of the Russian government was responsible, but to just run with it without any kind of skepticism or reflection, I think is really dangerous. And then you have John McCain only a couple months ago saying that it was, the DNC hack was an act of war. I mean, that's frightening. Those are serious things. We're making accusations against a nuclear power with which we have a long history of antagonism and close calls. And so to just take their word for it, I think is so beyond just strange as far as the job description for a reporter. It's scary to me.
Do you see, anecdotally, journalists shying away from being critical in this environment? Do you see it having that kind of an effect at all?
So there was a story about, you might have read it in Slate. It was this past fall, it was before the election, about Frank Foer wrote it. It was an elaborate story about how Donald Trump had a secret email server that was communicating with a Russian bank, and there were a lot of things wrong with it. But wasn't published was that every news outlet in the United States had seen that story. It had been pitched to them since as far as back as the summer before. We had gotten it about a month before Slate published it, and there were a lot of things wrong with it. It was sort of debunkable. But I think, and we finally did put out a story right after Slate did, showing the problems with this with these claims. But the fact that every other outlet just sort of sat on it rather than saying, or rather than criticizing it or refuting it, I think showed that they didn't want to be seen as Russian apologists or Putin apologists or anything that might even be, construed as saying, well, Trump's not that bad, and I think that's also troublesome for people who rely on American journalism.
So some people have described this environment as McCarthyite. Do you think that is a fair description or not?
No, I mean, until people are getting pulled in front of Congress, I don't think. I mean, no one's life has been ruined, right? I mean, if I get called mean things on Twitter, that's pretty far from being like put on some sort of blacklist or something. It's like maybe McCarthyism light or something. Like it's any kind of perceived connection to Russia is being viewed as now dubious. I mean, I think the thing with Michael Flynn was incredible. I mean, here's a guy who is reprehensible for a million reasons, and should have never gotten the job. Should have been fired for 100 reasons once he got the job. Well, right. But from this newest job, and what got him was the fact that he called a Russian diplomat, which is so far down on the things that are disgusting and slimy about this guy who's like I think truly mentally unhinged and a racist and Islamophobe. But he made a phone call to a Russian diplomat. We don't know what they talked about, but the mere fact of this phone call alone, and he lied about it, which was stupid, but that was enough to sink him.
But it wasn't even clear if he lied about it.
Well, we actually don't know what he lied
Well,
about. I mean, I think they just kept probably Michael Pence out of this just because he's more real conservative, but he couldn't have, whatever they talked about, he couldn't have talked about it without Trump's knowledge, who said, yeah, we want a good relationship with Russia.
But the fact alone that he had called the Russians, and first of all, the fact that we're even saying the Russians, like it's, like
well,
a
the
hockey
Ruskies,
team
you know,
or something.
hey, that's the
Yeah.
base to hate.
Like, you wouldn't see a headline being like Michael Flynn in hot water for calling England. Like that, you don't call other countries like that, but you call Russia like they have this hotline. But that did him in. It was that's basically what did him in, and good to see him. I'm not gonna miss him, but it would have been nice if he had been nailed for something, criminal or incriminating beyond a phone call.
Yeah. Did you want to say something?
No, I just, the minute you hear the word Russia, immediately it becomes a crime. Just Russia is a crime, essentially. And I think, yes, I think it's absolutely a great point, is that it takes away from the story every day. And since our conversation as to how we're going to get out of this, I don't know how we're going to get out of this, because nobody wants to get out of it. It's actually convenient to both countries. That propaganda rhetoric is really convenient. I think you were saying that it's just, the Russians need to tighten their belts because the Americans are going to attack us. And for the Americans is that any problem now that America is going to have with its own democracy, with its own imperfection and hypocrisy, it's all Russian fault. So I just don't see who wants to unravel it. I mean, unless some young generation of journalists come in and decide that they're actually going to look at facts, but, hopefully.
Journalism has become so much more important, and the idea of in-depth, fact-based, well-researched journalism, I think, is itself something that is under threat, as Sam said earlier, and a value that we're now realizing we need to support so much more intensely.
Yes.
Because I think that's where we are giving this gift to Putin that I mentioned earlier, of throwing ourselves into a tizzy about what is democracy, who are we, who is the enemy. That is all about our own media not being precise and clear and not providing the education that we all are looking for and need.
But, I mean, we're all products of the same culture. I mean, who reads books? Who has read Aldous Huxley, Brave New World?
If it's
Anybody
published
in
by
this room?
Verso.
Pardon me?
Then I'll read it.
Okay, so here you go. Okay, that's good. 1984, who read Bed Sinister by Vladimir Nabokov? Excellent, okay. So that, yes, who read 4 volumes of War and Peace? Let's do that instead of watching a movie, because it's not Downtown Abbey. It's actually an entirely different set of issues. So I think, you know, I have students who do want to do what you say they want to do, and then they go and tweet on Facebook with one hand and maybe read a headline with another. So we are products of this culture, of which Trump is really great commander-in-chief.
Right, news is entertainment.
News is entertainment.
Yeah. So, I'd like to open it up and have the audience ask some questions. I'm sure
Or
the
make
wheels
comments.
are spinning. Comments are also fine. Who's going to get us started? So I teach, as does Professor Khrushcheva, so we will start calling on people. if you don't volunteer.
No, I actually, if I may I have a question?
Please.
So I have a question for Sam. So, the Snowden story.
Yeah.
I'm very interested because, you know, he's our man now.
Yeah.
Did we give him citizenship?
No, you just
He's
gave
like
him
Steven
additional
Seagal
years.
and, you know,
He's just allowed this.
Additional
he's
years.
just
of-
additional years. So how is that story going to resolve itself from a spy perspective?
It's totally relevant because he's now been pulled into the Trump versus Putin showdown. You know, there's a counter narrative now where he was, you know, plotting to go to Russia all along, which just has no factual basis. How's it going to end? I think it either ends with him staying in Russia until he dies, or coming back to the United States and spending the rest of his life in prison.
Any other country?
If he could get somewhere else, I think he'd be somewhere else. No offense, I think his original
no,
his original plan was to go to.
These are very cold winters. I
No.
can't-
Well, right, yeah. His original plan was to go to Central America, which is a great place to hide out, I think.
No, absolutely.
Compared to, yeah, right. You know, if he could be on the beach with his girlfriend, I think he would be. He's stuck. I mean, his passport was canceled while he was, in transit. So I think it either ends with him being a geopolitical pawn in Moscow until he dies, or being extradited, where he's either executed or, you know, given the Chelsea Manning treatment without a pardon.
Yeah, there was a pardon, and there was a
No, there
movement to
wasn't.
pardon Snowden. which
Yeah,
is
that's. I
interesting.
mean, if
You don't
that's
think
not
that could ever happen?
not with Trump, not with Hillary Clinton wouldn't have pardoned him.
Well, but also with all this Putin rhetoric, I mean, clearly that is not going to.
yeah, no, he's
But I was
in
wondering
a
about
bad
another
place.
country, so no, okay.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, he has a very strong legal team with some credible people. Ben Wisner of the ACLU, and you know, I'm sure they have all sorts of contingency plans if things go really south. But I think he is profoundly stuck right now.
Any questions?
Any experiences with fake news?
Do you, hold on, we'll just get the microphone to you.
Okay, so I've heard the term pinkwashing a lot, used to describe how the U.S. media sort of talks about LGBT rights in Israel to sort of portray the nation as like, you know, a haven of like human rights or, you know, whatever. So I'm wondering, do you think that the opposite sort of rhetoric is being used in Russia or by the United States to sort of stir up anti-Russian sentiment?
I think that around when you had the propaganda law passed in Russia in 2013, that yes, you saw a real, that there was that plus Olympics in early 2014. And then with the U.S. snubbing Russia around the Olympics, specifically related to that law, yes, I think that there has been, you know, that has contributed to this narrative of Putin evilness. But I do want to point out that the situation for LGBTQ people in Russia is quite bad, and that people are, living under a great deal of fear. I'm not saying that, everyone is beaten, but there have been people who have been beaten. And that's, I think that that's not necessarily because Putin hates gay people. I think that it is, again, before there was this real ramp up of the United States is attacking us, there was this ramp up in, conservative values being challenged by these groups of people, and that group of people is challenging our values as Russians or challenging our identity as Russians. So it was another convenient scapegoat, and with real consequences.
Okay.
I guess just as a follow-up maybe to your answer, there's the LGBT rights issue from a few years ago, and then there's recently the really confusingly draconian domestic violence rollbacks, which feels like a weird phrase to have to use.
Yes.
Decriminalization. Decriminalization of domestic violence in Russia. But I think, is there anything meaningful to be drawn out in thinking about those tactics used by the Russian government and relating them to the politics of the Republican Party? Yeah, that's my question.
Yes. Oh, this is a good one. Okay, this is fascinating because I mentioned the propaganda law, and there's a long history about this, and I'm going to try to be short and not geek out about this. But you have, since about 2007, this uniting of the religious right in the U.S. and the Russian Orthodox Church, sort of some activists in Russia. And they have been getting together, this World Congress of Families. They've, now become international, and they've traveled all over. They had their last conference in Georgia to commemorate this beating of, a bunch of LGBTQ activists on the same date. I mean, they've become quite sinister. But what you do see is that things like the propaganda law are coming out of strategies that U.S. religious right activists, theorists, were trying to do in the U.S. and feeling like they weren't getting anywhere. They weren't getting any success. So they start meeting with their Russian counterparts, and they're like, hey, you should try this here. We think this would be something interesting to try. And it's actually they've had more success in Russia with things like the propaganda law. And, interestingly to me, the same Duma member that introduced the propaganda law, Yelena Mizulina, introduced the domestic violence rollback, and that is, coming out of her group of like-minded thinkers, which is we need to protect the family, the traditional family, and domestic violence is an intrusion of the state into the family, and the LGBT propaganda law is a threat to the family. But these ideas are not Russian ideas. They are this, I think, cross-pollination between the U.S. and Russia.
But I also actually would like to add to this that you can also look at this in geopolitical terms, because it was all happening when suddenly Russia realized that it's not part of the West. When the West says, well, it doesn't share the values, well, he sort of wanted, and he felt like Putin wasn't given a chance. And so around that time, with Ukraine crisis and then with the Olympics, it was around the time when Putin decided that probably siding up with the West is not going to work out for him. And so there's a lot of this very conservative countries like Iran that can work out. So he's going to be leader of those. So he was creating his new Warsaw Pact. Remember the Warsaw Pact when, so there was a NATO and the military pact of East European and countries and Soviet Union. So he was becoming a leader of conservative values for the rest of the world. And in this sense, it's not, he has no problem with with LGBT community. He has no problem with, I mean, you know, domestic violence. He thinks that the wife has to be the wife. That's why there's no first lady there at all. But generally, I think when one looks at Putin, one really needs to look at larger picture. And one of the problems, I think, with American foreign policy, Barack Obama called him the head of the regional power, and that really, really did it. So it really doesn't give a solution, but it does suggest that the more conservative Russia can be, it will be, because that's how it's going to oppose the West in its future policies.
Do you see those sort of policies that the religious right in the U.S. has helped pollinate in Russia boomeranging back at all?
So what I've seen is those policies going from Russia specifically into areas that Russia has a strong influence in, so Central Asia, you're seeing some of this, and then coming into Eastern Europe. You know, actually Poland has Catholics. Right. So Poland doesn't like Russia, but Kaczynski, you know, interestingly enough, that had, well, and it, like, seems to have a very similar mindset to
Yeah, but I
Putin.
mean, it's the era of dicks. I mean, we have to, let's just admit it. It's the era of dicks. I mean, every single leader, I mean, not every single leader, but a lot of leaders really want to use that formula, whether they love Putin or not. That's what it is.
Any other questions?
And I think, so this World Congress of Families organization is international, I think, and they get together and they try to organize, and I do think that you're seeing them like pushing ideas, not only in Russia, but also toward the US, but also in African countries. Like, you're seeing this kind of spreading out.
It's interesting, like these, you know, they talk about, there was an article, I think, in BuzzFeed about Trump supporters who were masquerading as French citizens to try and help get Le Pen elected. And this same group is very much supportive of Putin and sees him as this strong leader that is good for the United States, right? So what do you make of these sort of strange bedfellows, right? These are the kind of sort of conservative Americans I would have expected during the Cold War to be rapidly anti-Russian, right? And now they are, in many ways, very much in favor of the country. What does that signal to you?
But it's
what does
actually
that
not-
mean?
it's-
Or is it not strange?
No, it's not, because, I mean, George Bush administration really loved that. I actually call it Dick Cheney administration. Who were the neocons? They were the children of former radical Marxist supporters. So you kind of flip, I mean, with decades go by and you flip your relevancies, but you do have this kind of radical training and radical ideas. But I actually think that the Bush years were very important, Cheney years were very important, because they really opened up all this American hypocrisy instances that before were hidden because there was no internet, you really cannot spread the information as much. There was blogging provided an alternative story versus the New York Times that at the time was doing the nation challenged and therefore were not challenging the nation. So I think that this part is rather important. And then 2008 happened, and suddenly all these leaders, that's why I call it the Dick era, because all these authoritarian Democrats in some ways, because there's all elected, democratically elected leaders, or somewhat democratically. So they come in and they say, forget the human rights, because this is all messy. We cannot protect you from whatever the threats are there. So we're going to protect you. And for that, you have to give up certain values, certain freedoms, liberties. But generally, it's just going to be that kind of democratic formula. And if we look around the world, that is the era of those people. I mean, we have Viktor Orban in Hungary, we have Modi in India, we have El-Sisi in Egypt, we have Putin, we have Erdogan, we have Donald Trump, we have Marine Le Pen. So all these things that used to be fringe, because it's a liberal democracy and we think that Marine Le Pen is a fringe, they suddenly got, I mean, look, we have Steve Bannon in the White House. I mean, that's how unfringed that is. So I think it's really kind of the trend that we got to. And in some ways, it's really not that unusual from my point of view. I mean, it's depressing, but not really that surprising, I think.
So if there are no questions, then please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.
Thank you. You can go.